Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. All right. This is the button, right? Hi. Thank you so much for coming out today and for making time for this. I'm Helen Kapstein, as you've just heard. I'd like to thank Dr. Mohan Ambekapakar for the invitation, Suleka Cruzalta and Monica Espinoza and Wesley Lee for all the work they put into making this event happen, the Honors College and Class Honors and the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences for hosting me here at the University of Houston. Okay, so you might be wondering what a talk about petroleum, art, and Nigeria has to do with this year's Grand Challenges theme of Deep in the Heart of Texas. And you might be wondering what an English professor from New York can tell a Houston audience about oil. You might reasonably assume, to borrow a line from Texan author Joseph Schott, that the oil business doesn't give a bleep about Beowulf. But Beowulf actually has a lot to say about oil. Beowulf is a cautionary tale about the extraction of underground treasure, about monsters who guard precious resources, and about what happens when wealth is taken from the earth without regard for consequence. This talk is about how oil shapes the ways we imagine, represent, and interrogate the world. By reading Beowulf in this way, we're practicing something called the energy humanities. This is an emerging field that studies how energy shapes society. It asks a simple question with radical implications. What happens when we treat energy not as background information, but as a cultural force? It's a young field, and it claims for literary and cultural studies what has often been the purview of the sciences, of business, of economics, of political science. That is, energy extraction, production, distribution, and consumption. Energy humanities reorders our priorities as scholars, simultaneously pointing our attention to where energy sources, ranging from wood to tallow to coal to whale oil to gasoline or petrol, show up in texts, and also exercising analytical power over these representations. So what does that mean in practice? Anything from reading The Tempest for what it says about firewood and Caliban's forced labor, to reading Octavia Butler's speculative novel Parable of the Sower for its depiction of a post-petrol capitalist society, coincidentally or not, set in our exact present day. In fact, what both of those examples get at are anxieties about resource scarcity and fantasies of abundance. In terms of oil, this tension sits at the heart of industry debates about whether we have reached peak oil or if we live in a renewed time of plenty via technologies like fracking and discoveries like the 11 billion barrels of oil Exxon found off the coast of Guyana less than a decade ago. Regardless, the energy humanities help to name and therefore to theorize the conditions of our current conjuncture in which we are all steeped in oil. That is what we call our petromodernity. And the literature that grapples with it, either directly or obliquely, that is what we call petrofiction, and the analytical tools we apply to it, that is petrocriticism. Petrocriticism's conventional wisdom has it that we're so bound up with petroleum that it becomes invisible, that we just take it for granted. The story goes that the energy unconscious that we collectively operate within means that, to quote Graham McDonald, we don't really think enough about how we expect and trust the lights to go on when we flick the switch. But you, here in Houston, know better. When Hurricane Beryl took out your power grid 2 years ago, you were all too aware of our energy dependence and the countless ways in which we're enmeshed with power consumption, even as the systems that we rely on prove unreliable and fragile. In those days of power outage here, you Houstonians shared the familiar experience of the beleaguered residents of the Niger Delta, for whom the power goes out on a regular basis, despite the fact that they also live in one of the world's most concentrated areas of oil extraction. That sudden vulnerability is an experience that Niger Delta communities know not as emergency, but as routine. In fact, Delta State, where more than half the population doesn't have access to the grid at all, has been called a region of energy poverty. How ironic it is in both cases to have power outages in regions of energy abundance. But what the irony lets us see is that energy consciousness, as opposed to the unconsciousness that is the conventional wisdom, Energy consciousness peaks in inverse proportion to energy access dropping, or when the invisibilized infrastructures of energy extraction become visible and present. The immediacy of having to contend with it is quite different from the distance afforded by not fully knowing it. Petroleum infiltrates and organizes our lives both in its state as fossil fuel, per our deep investments in automobility, and via its byproducts, which include everything from contact lenses to perfume to heart valves and dentures. Mohan took some of my lines earlier when he introduced me, suggesting that if we just look around the room, practically everything here is a petroleum byproduct in one way or another, right? Your glasses and mine, the chairs you're sitting on, the soles of your shoes, right? My lipstick, these are all petroleum byproducts. This is a list from Dominic Boyer, who actually teaches at Rice and helped to invent the field of the energy humanities. And what he says about this is that plasticity alongside automobility remains a definitive aspect of petropower. It's also what makes petroculture so difficult to resist. One is no longer only resisting a fossil fuel, but instead a fundamental aspect of one's material environment. 60% of fibers circulating in the global economy now are synthetic fibers derived from oil. Very little of modern life exists outside of entanglement with petroleum's many forms. While synthetics and plasticity might sound unnatural, petroleum products are in fact what Jennifer Price says about pink plastic flamingos. They are, quote, wholly real and certifiably natural. It's just nature that's been mined, harvested, sold, heated, boxed, resold, and reshipped. Petroleum is a mercurial substance presenting various taxonomic difficulties. For instance, we elide animal, vegetable, mineral when we talk about fossil fuels as rock oil or mineral fuel, even though they're formed from organic materials, the buried remains of prehistoric organisms. I describe some of the many forms oil takes in my book, Petroforms, Oil and the Shaping of Nigerian Aesthetics. The various art objects and texts explored in petroforms meet oil as a crude resource leaching from the ground, a refined liquid carried through pipelines, and as gasoline and kerosene in automobiles and canisters. They meet it in different states of matter, as liquid commodity, as waste burnt off in gas flares, and as late-stage solid plastic products. This is the pitch drop experiment. It's been ongoing since 1930. It captures petroleum's category-confusing properties. It is both liquid and solid, static and fluid. The experiment was designed to demonstrate how some materials that appear solid are actually incredibly viscous liquids. Like you might know this about glass already, right? If you've ever been to like a medieval cathedral, the glass and the stained glass is thicker at the bottom of the pane because over centuries it's been slowly dripping, right? So here, the pitch or the bitumen, which is a form of petroleum, drips so slowly that a drop falls only every decade or so. And I happen to like the factoid that for most of the time that the drops have fallen, nobody's been there to see them fall. Somebody's like just left the room and then the drop falls. So it's sort of in keeping with this sort of elusive condition that oil is constantly performing. So when we intersect with the fossil fuel timeline in this way, it challenges our sense of the temporal scale, as does knowing that today we burn in one single year 400 years of plant and animal life produced over the entire Earth in the distant past. In fact, oil teaches us to misunderstand time, to act quickly on resources formed gradually while tolerating harm that builds incrementally. In this way, the experiment is emblematic of oil's simultaneous slowness and suddenness. Volatile and violent, it works slowly through extended processes like industrial pollution and climate change, and suddenly through abrupt events like explosions and spills. In places where people are subject to these forms of violence, it's not hard to find direct engagement with and representations of oil. Negligence and neglect on the part of big oil, which is sort of the catch-all name for the huge companies, Shell and Exxon and so on, has so drastically impacted the Niger Delta that its environmental degradation has been called ecocide. In these images borrowed from Ed Kashi's photo essay, Curse of the Black Gold, we see the overtly spectacular violence of gas flares and fires overlapping with the slow violence of habituation in the woman here using the flames to dry food. Or in the knowledge that the flares cause light pollution by burning all day and all night. Oil requires work, but in the form of labor made hard by its presence, not because oil companies employ locals, because they do not. Everyone and everything is saturated by it. And oil's accretions return in its plastic end products to their original site of extraction. These traumatic motifs repeat in much of the literature as well, like in this emblematic description from the short story Independence Day by Sefi Atta. Quote, "In my hometown, we had rainbow-colored water. It tasted of the oil that leaked into our well, bathing water we fetched from a creek. This smelled of dead crawfish. Our rivers were also dead. When rain fell, it rusted rooftops and shriveled the plants and farm crops. People who drank rainwater swore that it bored permanent holes in their stomachs. Our roads had potholes as big as cauldrons because of the rain. Only in the villages on the outskirts of town did we have one smooth road. The road ran straight from a flow station to Summit Oil's terminal. The villages had perpetual daylight once the gas flaring started. The flare was where cassava farms used to be. Summit Oil bulldozed those farms and ran pipelines through them. The land was now sinking. The gas flare was as tall as a giant orange torch in the sky, as loud as 100 incinerators. It sprayed soot over coconut trees. From the center of town, we could smell burning mixed with petrol. People complained that their throats were as dry as if they had swallowed swamp mahogany bark." In response to this reality, the art and literature of the Niger Delta produced what I call petroforms. Petroforms are aesthetic petroleum products. They're art forms that can only exist because they've been profoundly shaped by their efforts to grapple with the oil industry. Like plastics and lubricants and solvents and pharmaceuticals, they are, in a way, byproducts of crude oil. At the same time, and sometimes paradoxically, they exist in tension with oil, challenging its authority, its omnipresence, and its impact. Reshaping themselves in order to address the changing nature and problematics of petroleum, they help us understand form not as fixed, but as fluid, as a container reacting to its content. One example of this that I write about in the book is a play about village women who are striking over the unfair distribution of a payout from an oil company drilling on their land. If it were staged as written, the play would endlessly loop because the stage directions dictate that the character at the end start his lines all over again in the wings from the beginning. So in its unstageability, the play breaks with traditional dramatic form to create what I call petrodrama. Or we could consider what presents as conventional documentary film. If we look more closely, we can see those conventions as horror tropes. In addition to the monsters of oil and poverty, there's the eco-horror of unnatural environments, the body horror of physical degradation, and the psychological horror of ordinary life lived alongside extreme violence. This is another new form, petro-horror. These works don't just depict oil, they reorganize how oil can be seen, touched, and remembered, all of which is easiest to see for obvious reasons in the visual arts. One practitioner of petro art is Sakari Douglas Camp, a Nigerian sculptor who lives in London. Her sculptures, generally fixed and static, freeze moments of petro relations. In All That Glitters, a defiant female figure, showing off being invincible according to the descriptive note on her website, sits astride an oil barrel that has been sliced open. Now unusable for its intended purpose, the barrel is remade from commodity container into triumphant art. Inside the barrel, gold leaf winks at one of oil's many nicknames, black gold, and invites fresh interpretations of the proverb referenced in the work's title, perhaps that oil should not be mistaken for something nobler, or maybe that oil's changing nature means we cannot count on what it appears to be, or a warning that we should not let it dazzle us. Green leaf beryl bears a family resemblance to all that glitters. Here, a figure kneels to cultivate a perspex plant growing out of a barrel. Conquering the capitalist artifact, she coaxes out its latent nature, though of course among the ironies here is the fact that not only is this nature artificial, but that perspex, a branded form of plexiglass, is itself a petroleum product. Steel, too, is a problematic medium, a reality that Douglas Camp herself acknowledges, calling it in an interview, quote, a very polluting material, and remarking that, quote, the pieces that I've made about the situation in the Niger Delta have tried to highlight action and positivity, but are also made from steel and part of the destruction and deterioration of our environment. On her About the Artist page, Douglas Camp shares the genesis of her use of oil barrows and her awareness of oil's utter ubiquity. Quote, living in London and being gifted oil barrows by her local garage introduced this material to her work. This made Sakari think of her environment and the products that are derived from oil petroleum. Everything seems to have an element of this product. For example, on my desk, my keyboard, pen, sellotape, headphones, my jumper, and the concoction which has created my lipstick. Douglas Camp's figures frequently wear bright lipstick, the color popping against their metallic skins. In Open Blue Lips and Orange Lips, disembodied hands paint sets of disembodied lips, except the contents of the lipstick tube in each is a correspondingly colored toy car. The substitution makes explicit how the packaging of oil as cosmetics, in your headphones, in your clothes, is a form of containment and also concealment, a sly operation that inserts oil into everything. I love an accidental typo like this because it's so revealing. So our ready association of automobiles here in the form of the toy cars with oil, because of gas stations and oil changes and rubber tires, helps to make visible the less obvious links between petroleum and its seemingly endless product list. Douglas Camp has described oil as a magic product, both for its omnipresence and for its dangerous powers. It's a magic product, and yet it is killing us, she says. Reconfiguring oil barrels is one way to shake up our oblivious, ordinary relation to it and to reassert petroleum's place in the rank of marvelous objects, where Roger Bacon placed it circa 1268, writing, yellow petroleum oil, that is, oil arising from a rock, burns whatever it touches, if it is prepared correctly. For Bacon, oil's marvelous properties are not just medicinal or military, but the instigating fact of it magically arising from a rock. When Agricola, the mineralogist who's widely but wrongly credited with naming petroleum, does mention it, it's in a book whose title translates as On the Nature of Those Things Which Seep Out of the Ground. This intrinsic quality of oil, the very nature of it being a thing that seeps, also appears in Douglas Camp's art, especially in her wrestling series from 2018 and 2020. In these sculptures, we see two figures, made as always of steel, sparring on top of various oil barrels, one painted with both the Shell and the BP logos, and another a mashup of various different kinds of oil barrels, cooking oil, Gulf brand oil, which reminds us of the many different kinds of oil that trail social and environmental spoilage behind them, especially in Nigeria, not just petroleum oil. All the barrels are leaking, or at least they appear to be, if you look at the very bottom of those forms. But contrary to oil's true nature, the artificial seepage, also constructed from steel and found objects, is here halted and contained. Before Douglas Camp used oil barrels in her art, suggesting spillage, she incorporated oil and sometimes other substances that substituted for oil into a number of pieces. Here we see a large steel figure holding up a rectangular glass box with a pool of oil and an image in it. Douglas Camp explains that it's Kalabari tradition to carry an image of your deceased relatives with you. Knowing that, we can understand this figure to be announcing the death of a blighted landscape, either in despair, because oil wells and their fallout have killed things off, or in anticipation that eventually the oil industry itself will die off. Putting the scenes into the hands of the figure reduces its relative importance so that the site is held within the relationship by the borders of the image and the superseding embrace of the human. With steel as the medium, each figure in these sculptures is a double container, oil drum and body, and each container is its own surface, the taut limit at which our gaze stops. At least 3 of her pieces use that same image. It's a photograph of a crude oil facility and a nearby gas flare. Douglas Camp explains how the photo came about. She writes, "I'd been to Nigeria and taken a picture of a flow station, and the people at the flow station in the creeks of the Delta rushed out because they could see we were filming them and had to tell us, no, don't do that. So we sped off in a speedboat, and so it's quite a dramatic photograph. So I brought the photograph back and I put it on acetate behind glass, so it seemed very like the environment where this thing had been photographed, and to put oil inside a container seemed like the perfect thing to do." As explicated by that simile, very like the environment, the glass container stands in for the environment which the dramatic event, the flow station, and oil all occupy. In their new setting in the art, though, these things are forever frozen and can be replicated and manipulated into serving other purposes, such as activism. Putting oil into containers seemed like the perfect thing to do to Douglas Camp because oil demands a container. Containing it preserves that which has been extracted, here from the landscape, and which would otherwise seep out. As the blurb on her website says, "Nothing stays still." To quote Akila Mbembe, while it is true that the transnational regime of petrochemical extraction and petroagriculture is the chief engine of the Anthropocene, seeing human relations through the lens of what he calls the planetary pursuit of pure power and pure profit risks alienating us from lived experience. These works, in contrast, bring us back to Earth, where the local and the global run together. In this image, which is also from the Ed Kashi series, we see the entanglements of the hyperlocal with the multinational. We see pipelines running through a village, an unremarkable feature of the landscape for the girl in pink stepping across them. But if you look really closely, do you notice anything else about this image that stands out to you? Yeah. Exactly, right? So she's holding this advertisement, right? She's sort of a walking advertisement for the substance which is taken from her ground, from her community, but which she herself has no access to. To mark the 20th anniversary of author and activist Ken Saro-Wiwa's murder by the state in 1995, for organizing against Shell and for criticizing the Nigerian government for not enforcing environmental regulations on the foreign petroleum companies operating in the area, Douglas Camp built the public art project Battle Bus, living memorial for Ken Saro-Wiwa, which transforms a product of our petroculture into a critique of it. Her intention was to literally drive her point home, but that was stymied by authorities who seized it at the port of Lagos in 2015 and have kept it impounded ever since. The bus was on display in the United Kingdom for about 9 years, and then it was shipped to Nigeria by Platform, a collective campaigning charity based in London. It was reported at the time that Customs seized it on the grounds that it had, quote, political value, and stated that the inscription on the memorial bus is a threat to national peace. "I accuse the oil companies of genocide against the Ogoni," reads that inscription in giant capital letters that perforate the large steel plates comprising the roughly hewn outline of the bus, complete with steel windows and steel wheels. On top of the bus, 8 oil barrows inscribed with the names of the other members of the assassinated Ogoni 9 balanced precariously. It is not a subtle piece. Rather, it is consequential, spatially and semantically. Because the bus is not actually a bus, but rather a practical sculpture, to quote Douglas Camp, it has increased capacity to contain symbolism beyond normal use value. Douglas Camp has commented in any number of interviews on the bus as symbol, as a pollutant, a carrier of supplies and information, and as a metaphor for Saro-Wiwa's activism. While the bus sets out to mobilize people politically, Since it itself is not motorized, it cannot mobilize itself. It can only be moved by other means. It was transported around Britain by a haulage company. The double bind of being simultaneously mobile and immobile crystallized in what happened to the bus. Arrested by law and arrested by movement, it amasses contradictions. Notes Douglas Camp, it is ironic that it is a fuel-guzzling object. Can we have a lorry commemorating a campaigner against oil exploitation, she asks. Things are never black and white, and intuitively, she writes, I think Ken would like the irony of this because oil brought about his death, but it is also playing a part in educating the world about the Ogoni people's plight and the other peoples of the Niger Delta. Sakari Douglas Camp's art actively deconstructs the forms that contain and organize oil neatly into a transportable commodity, and therefore the ontology of oil itself as a known thing. At the same time, she makes beautiful, appealing works of art that center petroleum. We can understand this as a failure to fully repress the abject horror that oil ushers in, or we can understand it as an acknowledgement of oil's omnipresence. In either of those two interpretations, the art mounts a critique. But we can also see traces in her work of the romance of petromodernity, of what Stephanie Lemenager calls petroaesthetics. In my book, I write about this in the context of reading romance novels for their depictions of quasi-erotic fantasies of cars, of high-paying jobs in the oil industry, of hyper-masculinity in oil workers, and even in romance scams that play on that specific petro-imagery. Lemenager asks why the world that oil makes remains so beloved, and we can find one answer right here in Houston. Even if the experience of driving here isn't necessarily pleasant, petroaesthetics direct our gaze, constructing pleasure even if just for a split second before your eyes have to return their attention to the road. Aestheticizing the infrastructures of our petromodernity distracts from their ubiquity and their insufficiencies. Traffic jams are a constant feature of Nigerian literature. It makes us distracted drivers, literally taking our eyes off the road and off the harms and risks suffered by people and environments that make our cultural spatial norms possible. The slide that I chose at the top of this talk is Gas Flare by Nigerian photographer George Osodi. It represents the immediacies of life alongside petroleum extraction. And although I don't specifically discuss photography in the book, we could call this a petrophoto, and not just because of its subject matter. Oil's infrastructure structures and names this composition, as it has in other images that we've seen of pipelines and refineries and rigs. If I go back really quickly to the one of the woman crossing the pipelines, it's a gorgeously composed picture, right, in which she's smack square in the middle of this composition, and the pipelines collect at that distant sort of focal point, and it's all beautifully arranged. Whether it's staged or not, we don't know, but certainly it is this infrastructure that dictates how this photo is presented, how it looks. In this photo, the background flare, which is in focus, centers the human figure, which is not. It appears to be a child, maybe drinking from a tin cup. If so, is this the routine hazard of adjacency to the heat and to what's probably the contaminated water that he's drinking? Or is this child in some more immediate danger? If you look, the object that he's holding creates a small frame within the bigger picture frame. But it isn't a frame that opens up an aperture to let us see anything more clearly. It's a frame that obscures. Even though the emphasis here is on the industrial apparatus, it's still not possible to show the extent of the system or what remains hidden, from underground pipes to corrupt bureaucracies. As I said in the introduction to my book, a petroform is simultaneously reactionary in that it's a necessary response to oil's pressures and a byproduct of the commodity itself, and it's also resistant, an attempt at containment, at generating a retort to the very thing that shapes it. But oil, nevertheless, insists on escaping the frame. Oil reconfigures our lives, and especially the lives of those like residents of the Niger Delta, for whom it is everywhere and inescapable. In return, cultural production reconfigures to accommodate, address, and attack it. But this is process, not product. Petroleum keeps seeping, and form as container keeps spilling over with it. Sometimes that excess is reabsorbed, sometimes it requires a new container, and sometimes it stays messy. It may be, as Carolyn Levine says, the work of form to make order, but petroforms are inherently disorderly. They reflect a politics that acknowledges the seepage, but refuses to clean up someone else's spill. Thank you. Yeah, no, everything that you say rings true. You make me think immediately of Ken Saro-Wiwa's probably most famous work, which is his novel Soza Boy. Have you read it? It's amazing, and it's written in what he calls rotten English, which is sort of it's narrated by a child soldier in the Biafran War, and it's sort of pidgin/broken English, but he calls it rotten English for a reason. It's sort of been corrupted by all of the terrible conditions that this little child soldier is being raised in and suffers through. And although I think the novel doesn't mention oil at all, that I can remember, it is in fact an oil novel in that, as you've just said, it is a reaction to these much bigger, grander global pressures about who's competing for those valuable resources in that area, right, and who has control over whom. And yes, I think that it may not be as conventionally typical a decolonial movement, but it certainly was an effort to break away, to establish some kind of sovereignty, and et cetera. I don't know if you want to chip in as well. Yeah. I wish I had an easy answer that would solve everything. No, I mean, I think that I think we're pretty stuck considering the seepage and the movement and the constantly reshuffling landscape of all of this. And I think that it's when the talk was introduced and the headlines were put up on the screen about the EPA protections being eradicated today, despite all science to the contrary, it's this kind of moment where these things rise to the level of public attention that I think are moments that are sort of we can mobilize. There's moments of friction where something feels like we're being made aware of rubbing up against the realities or being made uncomfortable or being made worried or concerned, even if it's for self-interested reasons. So to the extent to which we can mobilize moments like these, great. It is incredibly daunting to sort of try to comprehend just how universal this petro-modern state is. Although something that is really interesting that comes up as an energy humanities discussion point is that we sometimes imagine that we're only in a moment of petro-modernity, but actually when I put up that list of all of the different kinds of energy sources that you can read literature for, we're simultaneously, contemporaneously also in moments of, wood modernity and coal modernity and all sorts of other energy sources are being used and burnt and extracted at the same time, right? So I guess the other part of the answer is we can shift not only because there are other resources that are already in use and being extracted, but because it's clear that there is, profit to be made off of the energy resources that we're only sort of beginning to build infrastructure around, like solar and wind and the other efforts that this administration would also like to stop. I see it as entirely intentional, right? In the same way that corporations greenwash their products to make us think that, you know, they're environmentally proactive and friendly, and they spend a lot of money on the advertising of all of that, much more than they do on the actual, you know, stewarding of the earth, right? To the extent that the example that I immediately think of in the book that you make me think of is one of the documentary films. It's not the one that I showed the still from, but one of the documentary films, Sweet Crude. The premise is that the filmmaker has gone to document the start of a small library somewhere in the Niger Delta. And then the film sort of goes in other directions that she didn't anticipate when she set out to film that story. But we find out, I think at the end of the film, that the library was funded by Shell from the very beginning, right? So even though she went with all of these other intentions, right, to celebrate, you know, some sort of new cultural establishment and, you know, a site of literacy and all of those things for, you know, a gift to the people of the Niger Delta. In fact, it was a sort of deliberate, you know, bait and switch in some ways, right? So that the oil companies would look better. Don't give up your toothpaste, yeah. Did you know that it was either one of the oil companies, one of the car companies that invented the idea of the carbon footprint, so that we would all feel as though we could sort of calculate our individual, you know, personal impact on the planet, so as to deflect from what, you know, the massive harms that they're doing, and to make it feel as though the burden lies on us, right? So I'm afraid that your plastic bags and your toothpaste probably make almost no difference whatsoever, right? They just make us feel better or feel guilty, right? What was I going to say about the beginning of that so Rob Nixon, who I referenced obliquely by talking about slow violence, is famous for this idea of, from a book called Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, for the idea that it's really hard to see things like chemical seepage and gradual pollution and the things that just kind of accumulate. And it's much easier to see the spectacular violences of, you know, whatever, the explosions and, you know, wars and whatever are. And as he's writing about Nigeria, he talks about I can't remember the exact phrase, but something about the romance between the Nigerian government and the oil companies. I think there's an adjective in there that I'm forgetting, the something romance between the companies and the government. And we heard about the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa, and that was because he was, you know, actively a very visible presence pushing back against that romantic relationship where they're in bed together. And so it's really not any kind of secret at all, right, that in this case, those two things, the corporate world and the state, are entirely hand in hand on orchestrating, you know, who has access to the resources and who doesn't.
Like indigeneity.
Yeah, great question. Obviously there's tons I didn't get to, but there's a strong through line in this argument about sabotage. And so when the local residents are energy poor, the pipelines run through the village, but they don't actually have, you know, gas in their homes. They're using kerosene lamps and, you know, burning whatever wood is left in the environment, and so on and so forth, right? So what they often do is they will sabotage a pipeline in order to siphon off oil to use it for themselves. And the argument on the part of Big Oil, Shell or whoever, is that this is sabotage and it is illegal and that the locals are stealing what belongs rightfully to Shell, and so on and so forth. But the flip side of that, of course, is that these people are just taking back what is already rightfully theirs, and what's been stolen. The real thieves are the oil companies, right? And so I think that it's that kind of intervention, although it's hugely complicated, right? Because a lot of the sabotage happens on the part of militants, and there's all sorts of violence that goes along with militias in the Delta. But this idea of sort of taking back what's yours because it is that deep possession that you're talking about, of not just the sort of horizontal surface of the land and the sort of where you visibly occupy space and whatever, but that deep possession of not only physical depth of resources underground, but of that deep, long, embedded history is part of what's being reclaimed by those actions. Sure, buy the book. No, this is not a Nigerian artist, and I don't know if we have an internet connection or anything, but somebody just sent me an image the other day, and I can find it for you and show it to you, of, I think she's an American artist, and she works with oil as one of her substances, and it was a clip of an artwork that was a sort of like table box thing, and on top was this kind of layer of what looked like bitumen or something like that, like in the pitch drop experiment, and then it gradually melts down the sides of the box that it's on as people move through the gallery over however many days it's in situ in the museum. And so it's an art object that is in action as people are moving around it, but again, almost invisibly. And I thought that was fascinating because it was sort of, an oil spill writ small, right? And I can find that artist's name for you. But yeah, there's, there are a number of documentaries I talk about. There's all sorts of fiction that I talk about. There's a lot of product out there, cultural product out there. And I love looking for those things in places where you wouldn't normally look. Like, I like looking for those things, not necessarily in the collection that, Penguin just published, right? But in places like internet forums, right? Nigerians are enormous users of cell phones and the internet. They read a lot on their phones. They write a lot on their phones. They're a mobile society in lots and lots of ways. And so places where people are, writing impromptu or amateur poetry, for instance, that's the stuff that I think is really interesting. Thanks. What's the short version of this? So I am the daughter of a journalist and grew up all over the world. And one of the places that I lived as a kid was South Africa in the apartheid years, because I'm that old. And this made a huge impression on me, and my personal experience dictated my professional life, and I became a post-colonial scholar because of that, and have studied South Africa since I was an undergraduate. So there's a lot about South Africa in that first book. Robben Island is one of the islands that I talk about in a number of chapters. The island where Mandela was in prison for 27 years, or many of the 27 years for which he was in prison. And then this was sort of the opposite. Instead of my interests dictating the project, I started teaching this material because it fit really nicely into a syllabus that I was, that I wanted to create. And the teaching of it was so exciting, and the reaction on the part of the students was so sort of engaged, that I became interested in this. And so rather, we often teach what we're studying or what we're writing about. And this was the other way around. I started to write about what I was teaching about. But I see, again, in the same way that I was saying earlier, that a fundamental question for me is sort of what's inside and what's outside, and can there ever be an outside to the master narrative and the status quo? Another through line is power and resistance, and I think that that's sort of pretty apparent here as well, right? And it seems that I can only write books that start with the letter P, because my next book is going to be called Power Relations, and it's about, speaking of sabotage, it's about the sabotage of energy infrastructure in South Africa over history. So both as part of the anti-apartheid movement, where the Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed branch of the ANC, would blow up energy pylons and that sort of thing to disrupt the apartheid government, but also into today, where there's a lot of very active resistance around who has access to the energy grid and who's excluded from it, and the ways you can sort of plug into the grid illegally and not be charged to pay your electric meter and that sort of thing. So that's the next resistant movement for me. Did I answer the question? Yeah. Sabotage or reclamation. I mean, it's like, is it a freedom fighter or is it a militant, right? It's how you spin it. I like the idea of reclaiming sabotage, right? Because to be a saboteur is to be the person who is shaking things up, making you rethink. This comes from sabot, the people, who were these sort of original disruptors in factories and so on, right? So I don't think they're mutually exclusive or at odds with each other necessarily. Yeah. Thanks. Anything else?